of the hour here on France 24. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We might be crossing over live. We're waiting, running a little bit behind schedule. They were earlier. We're waiting on a press conferences from some of the foreign ministers at that Friends of Syria meeting that's taking place here in the French capital. With us to talk about it, just as the UN Security Council in New York fleshes out how it's proceeding amid repeated ceasefire violations. In fact, some even arguing you can't even speak of a ceasefire at this point inside of Syria. With us to talk about it, Jamal Khashoggi of the Al Arab News Channel based in Bahrain. Thanks for being with us. Also with us, the former Lebanese Social Affairs Minister Salim Sayegh, who teaches at Paris's the University of Paris South or Paris 11, I'm not sure which, and Anton Kozlov of the American Graduate School. Before the break, we were mentioning the words of the U.S. Secretary of State about how to bolster the opposition. Here's what Hillary Clinton had to say.
I know that others are pursuing different types of support, but we are expanding our communications, logistics, and other support for the Syrian opposition. And in cooperation with Turkey, we are considering establishing an assistance hub that will try to co-locate Syrian activists and help them coordinate the collection and distribution of assistance to opposition groups inside Syria.
Jamal Khashoggi, it's been a year since this process began. The statement that we were just listening to there of Hillary Clinton, she's been tougher. Sometimes she's tuned it up and down according to what's going on. It seems as though when it comes to actively going down the Libya path, as the French president was alluding to this morning, a lot of people have shied away from that, and the Americans are not talking about sending weapons at this point.
I think the Friends of Syria meeting, they should agree in what direction they are going. Are we going into the direction of arming, of supporting an Afghan-style, Libyan-style warfare to topple the regime, or are we going to enforce a ceasefire through the Kofi Annan plan initiative, which I think they are going down that road right now. So I think they should stop.
And which plan's better?
I would go first with the Kofi Annan plan, because that could preserve Syria. We all should be worried about the state of Syria, because if the Syrian state breaks down, it's going to be a problem for all the region, for all of us. We don't want to see an Alawite state versus a Sunni majority state. We want to preserve Syria. That's how it should be. But in the same time, we need all the Syrians, the Friends of Syria, to support the Kofi Annan and use force, not by arming the resistant, by if it is proven that the Syrian regime failed to respect the ceasefire, then some NATO planes should go and hit certain target in Damascus and make Bashar al-Assad and his family feel what they have been feeding to their own people for the whole year.
So did Saudi Arabia and Qatar jump the gun when they were saying arm the insurgents?
I think they throw the idea in the form of a pressure because they get fed up with the situation, but they did not start. My information says that until now, there isn't a complete effort to finance or to support the resistance inside Syria. We haven't seen anything on the ground. The only shelling taking place is happening from the government side. But the Free Syrian Army, it is only on defense.
Salim Sayegh?
I think that the opposition is in the victim side. And there is, on the contrary, the government forces who have the monopoly of heavy fire. They are the ones who are really impeding the observers from completing their missions. This is why the head of the mission himself, the Norwegian general, who is known to be a very strict guy, because we know him when he was in the UNDOF head in southern Lebanon in the Golan Heights. A very strict guy, very honest guy. When he saw the Syrian conditions, he decided to leave and not to be there as somebody who is a false witness of what is going to happen. And this is what all the observers now, they are entrapped in a mission they cannot handle because the regime is imposing on them those very strict rules, where to go and how to go, etc. From the very beginning, before they go to the ground. So I think we should not mix, the victim side and the government side by equating them and saying that they equally share the same responsibility. Definitely, there is the government of Syria. There is the president of Syria. It is still recognized by the international community. Embassies and ambassadors are everywhere conducting diplomatic missions. They are to be held responsible for everything that is happening on the Syrian territory. And this is why I think that the internationalization of the Syrian question has to go on faster steps. It's in both interests of Syrian people, government, and then interest of Russia and the international community.
But when you say faster steps, you heard Annette Young there in part one say
Yes.
that the sanctions are indeed putting the squeeze on a lot of people. What do you do to go faster?
Actually, continue with the sanctions track and talking with the Russians seriously about the agenda. Not wait until Mr. Putin is put in place, because there is a G8 summit. On the margin of it, there will be a bilateral summit between President Obama and President Putin. And we expect that there things should be done as it should. This is why I think that this meeting is putting a new kind of frame, saying that there is the track of the sanctions, Friends of Syria, and I totally agree with Mr. Khashoggi saying that we have to give every chance for the Annan plan to be successful, but there is the other track, which is mostly finding a radical solution with Russia. Russia being one of the maestro, if not the maestro, of the of the transition period from the situation today to the post-Assad period.
Anton Kozlov?
Well, I think Russians will do everything to preserve Bashar al-Assad, because the issue, the stake in this war, it has nothing to do with Syria per se or democracy in Syria. There is a commercial conflict going on between Russia and Qatar regarding the markets for the natural gas. And that is precisely, I think, why the Russians are so reluctant, because Qatar is the biggest exporter of liquid gas and is aiming at the European market, which is controlled, well, I wouldn't say monopolized, but a great chunk of it is controlled by Russia. Now, if Syria falls, then Qatar will have direct access to the Mediterranean, build a pipeline, some say, and would access the market, and the Russians will be squeezed out of the market because the Qataris sell their gas below the price, the market price. So the Russians are very much aware of that. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why they're so reluctant, because you have to keep in mind that Gazprom, which is the biggest gas seller, is the biggest Russian taxpayer. Most of the, well, not most of the revenue, but a very large percentage of Russian budget is made out of money that are provided by Gazprom. So I think we have to consider that in larger geopolitical and geoeconomic terms. It has a lot to do with economic relations and the game being played in the Mediterranean.
The G8, the G8 summit, I think, it is going to link, in my point of view, the Syrian issue to the global issues that are of common interest both for the U.S. and Russians, most notably.
But hang on a second. Jamal Khashoggi, you were saying in part one of our discussion that the Russians felt railroaded before and that they have to be brought on board. You're saying it's not about politics or herd pride. You're saying it's about economic interests and the fight for gas markets.
Russians lost a lot of money in Libya. Clearly, they did invest in Syria. But what I'm saying is that they are also, of course, they want to have some respect, but they are projecting what's going to happen if Bashar al-Assad's government will be out.
But no one can determine that. It is in the foreseen. No one can decide.
But of course, the games of politics and projecting foreign policy is to be able to calculate how what's going to happen if And I think that is a very big concern, especially given the fact that in the past a year or so, there's been a series of diplomatic rows and conflicts between Russia and Qatar. Once they failed to agree on creating a joint venture on gas production and export, there is a conflict going on. And I mean, if you look at the bilateral relations, they've certainly been at the lowest point right now.
That's why I think we should spend more time with the Russians. The Assad regime is totally irrelevant right now. What is irrelevant is the Russians. We need to spend time with the Russians about this problem, the gas, to spend about their worries of the rise of Turkey. The Russians are so much worried about the rise of Turkey, and they know Turkey is going to benefit a great deal from the fall of the regime in Syria, and it will be the big prize for Turkey to look at Syria as one of its extended markets. So yeah, we need to spend more time with Russia. I see them here in the conference in Paris concentrating on the Russians' affair and trying to get the Russians on board. But what is worrying that we will gradually begin to forget more about Syria and talk about the process. Now the Syrian process will take control, and then we'll just be busy with another meeting, the G8 meeting, that Kofi Annan statement in the front of the Security Council, and then we'll just be busy with the process the same way we get busy with the process or obsessed with the process in the Arab-Israeli conflict. I just hope the Syrians do not deserve the same treatment, because what is happening today in the ground is very painful, and the world can make a decision tonight. They go to Homs or to Hama, and they are banned by the Syrian regime. They are an eyewitness to the shelling, and I think the observer can tell who is bombing who in Homs tonight. It's no secret. They don't need to be genius to decide who is doing the bombing and the shelling in Homs, and they can report that to New York. And in New York, they will tell the Russians who is bombing who in Homs.
As we speak right now, the Friends of Syria conference, again, being snubbed by Russia. Well, they're getting ready for the photo op. I guess they call it the family photo of those foreign ministers and officials. There you see the French foreign minister front and center, surrounded by his counterparts there in Paris. We don't see the UK foreign secretary on that photo. There was question as to whether or not he would be showing up for this meeting. This is one of many meetings, and Jamal Khashoggi talking about how this process is dragging on. It's already been 1 year. Salim Sayegh, how long will this go on?
I think.
Are we being too pessimistic about this in a way? Because we're now seeing a level of diplomatic activity with the Russians agreeing to sending those 300 observers. Are we perhaps being a little too cynical? Maybe things are moving faster than it seems.
Actually, by what standards? It's faster by what standards? Because according to news we had yesterday, the figures of people killed and disappeared in Syria are much more important than those that are recognized, even by the opposition. And this is what are the criteria to say this is slow or going to the right, on the right track at the right speed? Let me tell you something. I think that we have to observe how much the Russians are going to calculate the returns for themselves. I really believe that the more this conflict will go, the Russians will be again losing. Now they are at the peak of their power in Syria. The more the regime will be eroding, the less the Russians will get out of this situation in Syria. It is now, and the window of opportunity is only for a few months. It's now the high time for the Russians to come with the Americans and tell the Americans we have something to sell to you. Because in a few months from now, I think there will be nothing to sell, because the regime is not going, this is the dynamics of internal situation of Syria.
All right, so
the regime will not
Russian
be
influence,
substantial.
You're saying Russian influence is peaking or has peaked. When we asked the question, has the time for diplomacy passed on the France 24 Debate Facebook page, a lot of discussion was actually about the United States, and a lot of some of you expressing fears, like Omar from Kumasi, saying the U.S. wants to capitalize on Syria's crackdown, and no country will support imperialism and colonialism because it pulls a country backwards. But Syed from Kwekwe in Zimbabwe doesn't agree. He says boots on the ground in Syria is a necessary evil. Assad cannot be left to continue the bloodshed. It seems as though we're harping back to a bygone era, isn't it, in this debate?
Well, I think it is important to consider. Assad is certainly it is a dictatorship, but it is a secular dictatorship that's been around since 1970, roughly speaking. It tried to modernize Syria to whatever extent it had been successful is another issue. Definitely, I think the only way for the transformation of this regime, and there ought to be a democratic transformation, grievances of the opposition should be taken. Perhaps Assad should go. I mean, it is something for the Syrians to decide, but I think it has to be peaceful, it has to be negotiated. Any military intervention, we've seen military intervention in Lebanon in the early 80s, wasn't very successful when the Americans went there. So I think there ought to be a peaceful solution. Perhaps, further economic sanctions. Perhaps if.
But hold on a second. As Salim Sayegh is saying, the killing has spiked dramatically just in the past couple of months. And negotiations, while right now we're talking about observers going in, while a ceasefire that had been promised hasn't come into effect.
Well, look, I mean, what are we going to do? If you send troops there, killings are not going to go down. It's going to be more killings. We're talking about civil war. Right now, it is a low-intensity civil war, so to say. It's going to be a high-intensity civil war if there are troops on the ground. And it's definitely going to create a turmoil because, I mean, look, there's Hezbollah across the border. Iran is involved. Russians certainly will not be happy, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of elements that we cannot, at this point, predict how it's going to evolve. So I think it's better to preserve a bad peace than have a good war, because once it is out, we won't be able to control.
All right. Of course, Salim Sayegh arguing there is no peace right now.
There is no plan, or nobody is advancing the idea of having the boots on the ground. This is not on the agenda. On the agenda is that to pull things together and to convince the Russians once for all that they cannot morally and ethically afford the price, because what the Russians are saying to the Americans and to the international community, listen, you have done it in Egypt, in Libya, and whatever, unilaterally, without even consulting with us. We gave you the green light.
The Russians expressing again that issue of her pride. We're going to be going now to the French Foreign Ministry, where that Friends of Syria conference is taking place. In a short while there, you're going to see the French Foreign Minister is sitting down. He's going to be answering reporters' questions. Again, if you're just joining us here on France 24, earlier at the UN Security Council, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon announcing the approval by everyone, including Russia and China, of 300 United Nations observers for Syria. The foreign ministers there present in Paris include the U.S. Secretary of State, the French Foreign Minister, who came out with some tough statements about providing logistical support for those observers to have teeth. Let's hear what he has to say as we go to that conference in Paris.
D'Espagne, du Maroc, la haute représentante de l'Union européenne et les représentants des Émirats arabes unis, de l'Italie, du Royaume-Uni et de la Tunisie. Je voudrais excuser Madame Clinton qui a un emploi du temps extrêmement chargé et qui m'a prié de l'excuser auprès de vous et a dû repartir dès ce soir.
French Foreign Minister saying that the U.S. Secretary of State had to leave earlier and expressing his regrets over that. We're in the linear statement there of Alain Juppé. Again, the French Foreign Minister.
In the name of all of my colleagues and thanking them for trusting me, I would like to summarize what we said this evening. The states represented in Paris today share the same determination to find a solution to the Syrian tragedy. For all of us, it is a matter of putting an end to a 13-month bloodbath which has led to the death of 11,000 people, to the imprisonment of tens of thousands and to hundreds of thousands becoming refugees, and which destabilizes the region, as highlighted today in particular by my Jordanian and Turkish colleagues. It is a matter of allowing the Syrian people to build a democratic future respectful of the country's diversity. Our meeting is an extension of the efforts of the League of Arab States and the Group of Friends of the Syrian People, and I would like to say that France will shortly be organizing in the weeks to come the fully fledged meeting of the Group of Friends of the Syrian Crisis, the Syrian People, as was agreed in Tunis and then Istanbul. This meeting comes at a crucial point in the Syrian crisis. Less than a week ago, the Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2042. Yesterday, the United Nations Secretary-General made proposals for its implementation, and today the Security Council heard the presentation of Mr. Guéhenno, Mr. Annan's assistant. Our observation, which is unanimous, is both simple and worrying. We fully support Kofi Annan's mission, but we note that it is going through a critical phase because of Damascus' refusal to meet its commitments. After a few hours of faint hope, it soon became clear that the Syrian regime was not complying with its commitments, firstly, that of ceasing violence. It is again Homs and Idlib which are paying a high price, with new shelling and even more numerous victims. The countries meeting tonight in Paris demand that the Syrian authorities cease armed violence immediately in all its forms as they had pledged. It is the responsibility of all, particularly the members of the Security Council, to increase pressure in order to stop the violations of Resolution 2042. We welcome the responsible attitude of the opposition in the implementation of the Annan Plan. We keep working in harmony with the representatives of the opposition so that they unite themselves, structure themselves, and include all the shades and minorities of the opposition. We, next point, fully support the efforts of our special envoy, Kofi Annan. His plan is an opportunity for peace, which we must not let go. He must be given the means to carry out his mission. This is crucial. The Security Council will have to adopt a new resolution in order to put in place the observer mission. A clear mandate and full means must be given to the mission to fulfill its objectives. France, along with its partners at the Security Council, will soon propose a draft resolution. What do we mean by a credible observer mission? The UN Secretary-General clearly answered this question. In order to fully carry out its mandate, this force must have sufficient staff, deployed as soon as possible, and must cover all areas affected by the events. The Syrian authorities bear primary responsibility in order to set up the conditions on the ground that will enable this deployment in accordance with the resolutions of the Security Council, and we will make sure that this force enjoys a full freedom of movement without prior notice all around the country. Its freedom of movement must be guaranteed without the Syrian authorities being able to hinder the mission's freedom of movement. Finally, the observers must be given all necessary means to carry out their mandate, including all modern equipment, allowing them to ensure efficient monitoring. Thirdly, the action plan defined by Kofi Annan is not only designed to end violence and repression, but also to facilitate transition to a democratic system in Syria. And I would like to remind you that this is a 6-point plan. As stated in the plan, the Syrian people should be able to freely demonstrate. No infringement of this fundamental right is acceptable. The Syrian opposition plays an essential role in this political transition. And in this regard, we support, as I said, the efforts engaged by the Syrian National Council to bring together all opposition currents. Another point, the countries meeting tonight in Paris expressed their strong concern regarding the degradation of the humanitarian situation in Syria and its impact on neighboring countries. And we're committed to provide all forms of humanitarian assistance and use all possible channels, first of which those of the United Nations. Lastly, every day, dozens of civilians die. Time for endless discussion is over. We must act now. Even fragile, there is hope in the Annan mission. We are entirely determined to ensure its success, and should it fail, the Security Council and the international community would have to study other options to deal with this terrible situation. These are the points we agreed upon, which I'm sharing with you in the name of all of my colleagues, and we or I are available to answer a few questions, even though we have a very tight schedule.
Mr. Minister, will there be a conference or a meeting or a NATO meeting organized and devoted to the Syrian situation? Mrs. Clinton suggested that that might be the case. And if I may, I would like to address a question to His Royal Highness Saud Al-Faisal Al-Saud.
عن تسليح وتزويد المعارضة والشعب السوري لحماية نفسه فهل هذا سينفذ؟
And to the Syrian people so that they would be in a position to defend themselves. Will you arm the opposition and the Syrian people? Will you put your words to effect despite the opposition of some? Well, if I may, I'd like us to field one question at a time and not three questions per representative of the press. Now, regarding your first point, as I'm sure you know, there was a NATO meeting organized today. This matter was not touched upon. I would only add that if a NATO member state was attacked, that question might arise, of course. However, that is not on NATO's agenda to date. Now, I don't know whether my colleagues want to answer the questions that were put to them.
Mr. Alain, that you will talk on all our behalf.
Voilà, donc je réponds au nom de tout le monde et donc sur ce.
So, I'll be the spokesperson for all. Now, Ma'am, you will be able to put your question again at some point in the future. Other question. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Le Figaro newspaper. We have just learned that the head of the Military Council of the Free Syrian Army has requested a military intervention in Syria, even if it is not approved by the UN Security Council. Now, we know that the victims are increasingly numerous and the situation is worsening. Now, would you be willing or ready to review your position against the military intervention in Syria? Well, I believe I have always been perfectly clear. Today, our top priority lies in the effective and full implementation of the Annan Plan, which, in our eyes, represents the very last chance for peace and the very last chance to avoid a civil war in Syria. Now, in order for that plan to have a chance of success, we must deploy on the field as soon as possible a monitoring mission that is as robust as it can be made. Now, on numerous occasions, I have mentioned the fact that were that mission to meet with failure, other options would have to be studied, but that is not the case today. Egyptian press agency. My question is addressed to the Egyptian minister. Ma'am, I will be answering all questions on behalf of the group. As my colleagues requested, I do. Now, I'm sure you'll have ample opportunity to put your questions to them directly later on if you like, but I will field questions regarding our work in their meeting today and our joint positions. What is the next stage? What is the next step that you are considering as you deal with the Syrian situation? Well, the following two steps, of course, will be referred to the UN Security Council. First of all, to adopt a resolution for a monitoring mission that goes beyond the current preliminary monitoring mission. I believe that in the future we will be able to win over the support of the Russians in this matter, given that they have always been in favor of a monitoring mechanism. Now, soon in Paris, we will organize the plenary meeting of the group of Friends of the Syrian People, which we can only hope will be